Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment, but in the past everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier, whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that, and eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you know, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands of machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where, you know, every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So, I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines, authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, a New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering, we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'm gonna give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right, and so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody it's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where, cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section, we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. So this big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IAAS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IAAS. Now with IAAS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So, now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PAAS and SAAS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PAAS and SAAS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IAAS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PAAS related and software as a service SAAS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about Azure's. With Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out, but it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Let's spend a few moments now talking about and understanding the Microsoft IAAS, PAAS, and SAAS offering technologies that we have in our Microsoft Cloud Services. Now, to begin with, you have IaaS. This is Infrastructure as a Service. Now, the concept of Infrastructure as a Service is to offer computing power to companies that are looking to move things out in the cloud and allow a cloud company to host these services for them online. So instead of, again, you setting up your own physical servers in your environment or even setting up physical servers and then setting up virtual servers in your environment and offering those servers to your clients, in this case, you can host all of that out in Microsoft's cloud services, which is mostly Azure, right? Azure is their main infrastructure as a service technology. Okay, and of course, there are concepts in which with IaaS where we can host virtual servers, virtual machines, have virtual guest operating systems running on there, and then have these services made available to our users. And they can even offer some other types of things on top of their IaaS service. And then, of course, that's where it sort of plays upon SaaS, which is software as a service, and PaaS, which is platform as a service. But I'll expand on those coming up here in just a moment. Now, the idea of this, though, is they're going to be offering you their data center, their buildings, their air conditioning and power, and their massive amount of redundancy that they provide. Microsoft can actually provide you with an insane amount of redundancy, especially for your data. In other words, if something happens to their servers, their equipment, their data center, whatever it is, Microsoft has an extreme amount of redundancy there that they're going to provide you as part of their SLA, which is their service level agreement. Okay, you get a minimum of a 99.9% of the time, but when you start getting up into the storage area of Azure, they actually offer up to 15 nines of actual redundancy. So basically, in a month's period, your downtime should be microseconds, not even noticeable, if you actually pay for that extra redundancy. So with IAAS and having all these data centers, you're talking, they've got something like 60-something regions, 60-something areas of the world where they've got data centers. In most of those regions, they have at least 3 data centers that they're dealing with. So you're talking an extreme amount of equipment here, an extreme amount of redundancy. And of course, with that comes all the equipment being able to offer you CPU, RAM, storage, network. And that's really what IAAS is all about. You're paying for the computing power, the CPU, the RAM, the storage, the networking, and you're paying for what you use, essentially, okay, in regards to that computing power, CPU, RAM, storage. They provide other services such as firewall and load balancing, and essentially Microsoft will host virtual appliances out there, just like where, you know, in a physical network you would buy physical equipment to do these jobs. Well, with IAAS, they're offering you the virtualization of it all. They're virtualizing equipment and making that available, and you basically pay for what you use. You pay a monthly fee for what you use. Now, there's also PAAS. Some people just pronounce it PaaS, Platform as a Service. Now, Platform as a Service, this is a step up from IAAS. So they're handling the data center, the equipment, the air conditioning, and power and redundancy, the networking, storage, virtual appliance, the storage of all of it, the operating systems themselves, and they can even provide you with the tools you need to host applications and provide services of your own. So they're providing some actual platforms, databases, and web-based portals and interfaces to do this. Okay, Office 365, for example, Microsoft 365 itself, Microsoft 365 being a platform as a service, Office 365 is partly a platform as a service, but also Office 365 is a software as a service. But essentially what they're doing with PaaS is they're offering this web-based platform for managing applications and giving people access in different instances of that platform as a service can be offered to your users, or even if you are some kind of a service provider yourself, you could offer these to your customers. And so the idea is with a platform as a service is anybody that is a tenant, which is somebody that is subscribed to the Microsoft services, can get an instance of a particular platform that they can use, the Microsoft 365 services being a platform that they can use. Now, the funny thing about platforms as a service as well is some of it can be pay as you go, pay for what you use, and some of it is just based on licenses. So it's kind of a mix. You'll have part of it being geared more towards IaaS, which is paying for what you use, and then another chunk of it is paying for just a license to use certain tools and get access to certain things, as we have with Office 365 and the Microsoft 365 services themselves. Now, again, the Microsoft 365 service, the big platform used to be called Office 365, and then they changed the name over the last couple of years to Microsoft 365, being the main PaaS platform. And that's where the confusion comes, because now they're saying what they were saying is Office 365 is a platform as a service and a software as a service, which you still can say that, but now what they've done is they're saying that Microsoft 365 is their main platform as a service. Office 365 is sort of a mix, but the app side of Office 365 is geared more towards SaaS, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So again, the key to understanding PaaS, platform as a service, is Microsoft in this case is offering a whole set of web-based platform tools that you can configure yourself. It's an instance of all of these tools and all these services. You can configure them yourselves. They offer databases and everything to go with them. And then you can use them for your own environment. Some of the cost is going to involve pay for what you use, and some of it is going to involve just paying a licensing fee for whichever services that you're going to be using. They provide all sorts of things. For example, Kubernetes. If you've never heard of Kubernetes, it allows you to generate these things called containers and do orchestration of containers, managing instance of these virtualized containers on the fly. So imagine if you were a company that wanted to host a bunch of web services, and you needed to be able to scale those web services to an ungodly amount, meaning, for example, in part of the year, maybe you're an e-commerce company, and you do sales online, and you have a certain amount of customers that are hitting your website throughout the year, but then all of a sudden the holiday season hits, and then you're getting way more hits than you used to. Kubernetes is a platform as a service that can actually scale out your web services into these little things called containers, and it can generate them very fast and a large amount of them to handle the amount of load that you've got coming in from, say, web services. And then, of course, holiday season ends, and maybe you're not getting the amount of load that you used to get. It can scale it back. Okay. The other thing Platform as a Service brings to the table is a lot of development tools. So if you're a developer company and you're developing software, they offer everything you need for handling all of that. So Platform as a Service, definitely kind of a cross between IAAS and SAAS in the way that it's implemented. And finally, understanding SAAS, sometimes referred to as SaaS. All right. So software as a service is offering a piece of software as a service that's going to be maintained by Microsoft. Their big software as a service is Office 365, which again, the confusing part of that is that has always been also a platform as a service as well. So I know that's a little bit confusing. Now what they're sort of getting at is that they're saying, okay, well, Microsoft 365, even though Office 365 is part of Microsoft 365, it's a platform as a service. And then Office 365, if you're speaking purely about, deploying Word, Excel, and PowerPoint and all that, that is SaaS. Okay. So yes, if I was to ask you the question, is Office 365 software as a service? I would say yes, it is. Is it also a platform as a service? Yes. However, if you're purely talking about the management of Word and Excel and PowerPoint and all these apps, then you would just purely be thinking in regards of software as a service. So I know that it walks a line of being both sides, but you can technically say that Office 365 is SaaS, software as a service. Okay, so software as a service means that the cloud provider is handling everything, including the application itself, and basically you are paying to use that application, or if you will, you're renting that application to be used over the web or to get access to it. And even downloadable software can be seen as software as a service. So for example, with Office 365, you can have a license for that. You can download the Office apps, which is called Apps for Enterprise, formerly known as Pro Plus, and you basically have access to all these applications that you can download and you can use. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of that you can download and you can use. And of course, if you don't pay your monthly license fee, then eventually your software will get deactivated. Okay, so that's how that works with software as a service. So it can be a web-based software that you get access to, that you pay usually a monthly fee to get to, or it can be a downloadable app. Okay. In most cases, software as a service is you pay a license fee to get access to it, as opposed to paying like the CPU, the storage, the RAM, all of that stuff. Okay. All right. So hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding now of the differences in regards to IAAS, PAAS, and SAAS in the Microsoft cloud environment. So now I want to look at the Azure portal, so we can kind of look at Azure AD and talk about some of the administration we can do on that side of things. So if I actually type portal.azure.com, that's going to bring us over to the Azure portal, all right, which is where Azure Services is all going to be managed. And then I'm going to click the little menu bar here, little menu button, and I'm going to click down on Azure AD because that's what we're going to be mostly focusing on here. And this is, of course, where you can manage users and groups. Keep in mind that even in Microsoft 365 services, they're storing their users and everything over here in the Azure AD. So this is all the same. So if I create a user, for example, here under the users blade, it's going to be reflected over on Microsoft 365 side of things as well because, well, it's all kept in Azure AD. Same for my groups, okay? As well as working with things like roles, my devices, licenses, and all that. So I can actually see the licenses and stuff here, just like I can over on the Microsoft 365 side of things. Password settings can all be controlled here. The main thing to get across here is that even with Microsoft 365 services, it's keeping all of its user accounts, passwords, groups, all that stuff all over here on Azure AD. So really the two things are connected. But there are going to be a few things you can only do on this side in order to accomplish certain tasks. For example, if I'm going to be setting up what is known as Azure AD Connect, where I'm going to be synchronizing my on-premise environment with the cloud and all of that, I'm going to be doing that over here, okay? This is where I'm going to be managing all that, okay? So hopefully that just gives you a kind of a quick look. Maybe you don't have a lot of experience working with this, or maybe it's been a while since you've been in this neck of the woods. So this gives you a chance to sort of get back in there and kind of click around. You're welcome to, if you've set up a tenant, you're welcome to kind of click through and look at some of the different things you have. Keep in mind, I'm going to be talking about a lot more as we go on. This was just a quick overview for you of jumping over into Azure AD and having a look. Let's talk now about the concept of Azure Active Directory and some of the different versions that are available to you. Now, we know that Azure Active Directory is the directory services that we use in the Microsoft Cloud Services. So I don't care if you're talking purely just Azure, or you're talking Microsoft 365, Office 365, Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, all of these different cloud services in the Microsoft world utilize Azure Active Directory, okay? And even, of course, if you've got an on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, and you're using a hybrid environment, you're still going to involve Azure AD if you are using cloud services with Microsoft for the most part, unless you're integrating with AWS, Amazon Web Services, all that, which we're not getting into right now. You are using Azure AD. Azure AD is the foundation directory service that we use in our cloud services. Now, first thing I want to look at here with you is just the different versions of Azure AD that we have. Now, Microsoft is really good about keeping documents updated on their different technologies and capabilities. So what I encourage you to do is, go to your local search engine, Bing or Google or wherever, and then do a search on the following keywords. Just search Azure AD P1, P2, and Basic. All right. And Microsoft has a great article right here that gets into the different versions of Azure Active Directory. Okay. So if we kind of look through here, you'll see this one. This is creating an account. We don't need to create an account, but we look at pricing right here. This article right here is the one that I want to look at. So we're going to go there to this pricing article. And again, you can do the same thing I just did if you want to pull this article up. And Microsoft shows you here that there are different versions of Azure Active Directory. Okay, so main thing I want to point out is we have a free version of Azure Active Directory, and you can see some of the different capabilities that you're going to get with it. Okay, and you look here, you've got support for 500,000 objects with the free version, single sign-on, user provisioning. You do federated authentication, user group management, device registration. So there's a lot of different features that you get even with the free version. So when you initially set up a free Azure Microsoft 365 account, okay, that's what you get. You get that completely free. It doesn't cost anything, and you get all of these different features that you're seeing here. Of course, once you get here to where it says external identities and all that, you start noticing the check marks start to drop off a little bit right here for free. And then if you look, you got another version called Office 365 Apps. Now, they used to call this Basic, so that's why a lot of times you'll see articles talk about the Azure AD Basic, and now it's called Office 365 Apps. So if you have an Office 365 license, then you get the Office 365 app version of Azure AD, and you get a slight increase on your features. So as you can see here, company branding, self-service password reset, improved service level agreement. Basically, with the free version, you're not really guaranteed availability, high availability with your user identities. But if you have this version or any of the later versions or the higher up versions of Azure AD, you do get all of that. Okay, you get device write back. This gets into if you're doing a hybrid environment between your on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, and Azure AD. You can have device information written back to your on-premise environment. Of course, that's where things drop off if you have Office 365 apps, again, also known as Basic, or I should say formerly known as Basic. Then we get into the premium versions of Azure AD, P1 and P2, Premium 1, Premium 2. Now, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of this article, you'll notice that it shows the cost. Now, of course, the free version's free. The Office 365 app version comes with these different Office 365 licenses of subscriptions that you have. Okay, and then here is P1 and P2. Okay, so $6 a month, at least at the recording of this video. You got to remember Microsoft changes the prices periodically, but if you look at this article, you'll see the latest and greatest of that. Of course, this is looking at it from a United States dollar amount, but $6 per month, $9 per month for Premium 2. Now, if you look down, again, it kind of drops off here with the Office 365 app version, and that's where you start getting into some of these other features. Now, most of the other features, what you're going to notice with Premium is you get a bunch of extra security features. So if you want to know the big difference, it's going to involve security, okay? So password protection, extra password protection, self-service password changes and unlocks, and on-premise write back for passwords if you have a hybrid environment, group access management, cloud app discovery. There's more mobile device management support, self-service BitLocker recovery for recovering BitLocker keys. So a bunch of extra things here that you're getting. You can see all of these different features here. In this course, we're not thoroughly getting into each and every one of these details right now, but some of the other courses that are out there definitely do. But as you can see here, you've got it drops off right here, okay, and it tells you that third-party identity governance, and that's where things stop. Now, with P1, you get all of those features. With P2, you get the rest of the features, and these are pretty awesome features. Vulnerability and risk accounts, risk event investigation, risk-based conditional access policies. So what am I getting for this extra $3 a month per user? Okay, well, basically Microsoft uses artificial intelligence, machine learning to analyze users' logons and to determine if a password or somebody's account has been hacked. So, for example, if a user logs on in New York City in the United States, and then 5 minutes later somebody logs over, over in China, that looks suspicious. It looks suspicious, but it isn't that it's necessarily just going to instantly block you. It could be that the user is logged on in the United States and they are connecting into a remote machine over in China and logging on. So you could legitimately have somebody logging on that owns the account. But Azure would see that as suspicious, and Azure can do things. It can challenge the user even more by using multi-factor authentication or something like that to verify that you are who you say you are. But it uses machine learning. It looks at the places where the user logs on average. It looks at when they log on average and the things they do while they're logged on. And then it gathers a baseline of security information based on what it's learned by analyzing those patterns over a period of time, and then from there it can determine if there's a chance that a user has been compromised. Another thing you get is this identity governance, and this is really awesome too, because privileged identity management, for example, what that's going to do is it makes it where I can give out temporary roles to people. so in Azure AD, we use roles to control the permissions, the rights that you get. But with PIM, Privileged Identity Management, I basically get this ability to say, hey, you temporarily get this access over a period of time. Okay. And then maybe I'm the main admin and I'm going to be on vacation next week. And so I want to temporarily give a user some privileges to do things for a short period of time, for maybe just next week. Okay. And so I can do that and then have it expire, like, let's say on Friday or something of next week when I get back off vacation, whatever. So that's what PIM will do. You can also make it where a user has to ask for the power from a manager for a temporary amount of time, and then it gives it to them for an hour, and if they want to ask for it again, they can. This is really neat technology. You have access reviews. That makes it where periodically users who are members of groups and have role access and things, periodically that has to be reviewed to determine whether or not the user has it. And title management. So this is all about controlling whether or not somebody should have access to certain information. So as you can see, with this extra, $3 extra a month, you're getting Premium 2, and Premium 2 gives you some really great extra security features. Now, how do you tell what your current Azure AD is at? So you can tell if you go to portal.azure.com and go ahead and sign into that. All right, and if we click the menu button here and go to Azure Active Directory, we can see right here that I am currently at Premium 2. All right, now I can also click on Licenses and then click All Products, and I can see. Now the reason I'm at Premium 2 is because I have this Enterprise Mobility Plus Security E5, and if you click on that and click on Service Plan Details, you'll notice that's where you're getting your Premium 2 from. Of course, if you're EMS, if you don't have EMS or your EMS is expired, you can go over here to License Features, Overview, and then click on Get a Free Trial. And I had activated my EMS license, and that gave me Premium 2. But once that expires, I can also activate this Premium 2 trial and get another period of time where I get to play around with Premium 2 in this little trial tenant. Okay, but that's how you can tell. Again, you go to Azure Active Directory, and you can see right here under tenant information that you're currently at Premium 2. Users also have to be licensed for Premium 2 in order to be support the Premium 2 features. So again, if I go to Users and I click on a particular user and look at the user's licenses, this user has no licenses, but if I assign this EMS license, they will have that Premium 2 license. Okay, and so that is how that's going to be the difference between the P1, P2, the Office 365 apps, formerly known as Basic, and then the free version of Azure AD. Now, when it comes to working with Azure AD, it's important to understand that you'll be interacting with your different resources in a couple of different places sometimes. You'll be utilizing your Azure resources, Azure AD resources, using portal.azure.com. There's also the Microsoft 365 side of things, and remember that Microsoft 365 is really integrated with Azure, and of course Microsoft 365 services, where you start working with Office 365 and Exchange Online and SharePoint and all that. All of that's connected and all shares the same directory service. So it all boils down to Azure AD, right? If I'm on portal.azure.com and I click the menu button, I've got Azure Active Directory, and then from there I can click on users and I can see the users I've created. And granted, you may not have all the same users I have right now, but I've also got groups. Same thing, you may not have all the groups I have right now, but I have in Azure AD, I have all these things. Now, if I was to jump over to portal.microsoft.com, here we are, portal.microsoft.com, and we drop down users, click active users, you're going to see the same users. Okay, click on groups, active groups, you're going to see the same groups because it's all linked together. Now, throughout the lectures here, I'll be kind of jumping back and forth because there's going to be some things where it makes more sense to do it through Azure AD, and in some cases you have to do it through Azure AD from within the Azure portal. And then there's going to be some things that you're going to utilize Microsoft 365 Admin Center for. Believe it or not, the two are connected, but there are going to be some features you have to use Microsoft 365 Admin Center for versus using the Azure portal. So it's all really connected, and as we go through, you're going to see me jumping back and forth a lot. And then the other thing is, of course, PowerShell. PowerShell is another way that we are going to be interacting with Azure AD and Microsoft 365 services. Now, it all kind of relates back to Azure AD though, because Azure AD is our directory service, and ultimately Microsoft 365 as well as Azure, they share that same directory service. Now, like most Microsoft environments where we're working with products and trying to manage products, one of the things that Microsoft has really put a lot of stock in over the years is PowerShell. And if you're going to do administration with any of the cloud services, whether it be Teams, Exchange, SharePoint, Azure AD, Intune, all the cloud services nowadays, as well as the security and compliance capabilities of the Microsoft cloud services, PowerShell is still a major component of really working with all that and managing all that. It's an important piece of the puzzle that is your Microsoft services that are out there. Okay, I want to spend some time making sure that you guys have the fundamentals, because it's really hard to understand, the more advanced things that you can do with your command line environment if you don't understand the basics. So I want to make sure that you understand the foundation of PowerShell. Now, of course, if you already feel like, oh, I'm an expert with PowerShell, you can move on. But this is going to help you have your fundamentals that are needed in working with PowerShell. Now, the first thing to understand is you can get into PowerShell in your operating system by clicking Start and searching for PowerShell. You can right-click your Start button in Windows, like Windows 10. You can go to PowerShell. I recommend opening up PowerShell as an admin, because you're going to have administrative privileges, and some of the things that you're going to want to do, you're going to need administrative privileges for, okay? And then the other option is if you're in command prompt, you can open up, if you go to command prompt, you can just type the word PowerShell, and you can get into command prompt, okay, and work with PowerShell that way, okay? Now, there's two main ways of dealing with PowerShell. One is right here in the command line environment version of PowerShell, where you can run commands just kind of like what you're used to with command prompt, or maybe you have experience with DOS back in the day, or maybe you're a Unix Linux person, so you're very comfortable with the way that working with the command line environment goes. This is great for you. Another way is Microsoft has a scripting environment that is built to help you with writing scripts involving PowerShell, and it's called the ISE. You can type ISE, and that will open up the integrated scripting environment, and this will help you if you are wanting to run scripts and things like that within PowerShell. This is a great way to do it, because it's going to sort of baby you through the process of writing a script. Okay, I'll look more at that here coming up in just a minute, though. I'm going to minimize that, get back into regular PowerShell. Now, PowerShell, it really does live up to its name. It's an incredibly powerful command line environment. If there is such a thing as an intuitive command line environment, an easier to use command line environment, I really do think that you have a good case to argue that PowerShell is one of the easiest command line environments you can use, because it has a lot of tools to help you and make your life a little easier. Okay, for one, it works off of a verb-noun system. Whenever you run a PowerShell command, it's going to start with a word that is a verb, and then there's going to be a dash, and then there's going to be a noun. For example, if I want to see some information about something, I'm going to use the verb get. Get means get me some information. But if I want to change something or alter something, I'm going to use the word set. Okay, set's going to let me modify, it's going to let me alter something or change something. If I want to delete something, I could use the word remove. That's going to delete something. Okay,
If I want to move something, I'm going to use the word move, or copy something, I'm going to use the word copy. Okay. If I want to start something like a service, I'm going to use the word start, right? And then if I want to stop something, it'd be the word stop. Okay. So it uses a verb noun system. Okay. Speaking of services, for example, if I wanted to see what services are running on my Windows operating system right now, again, not even talking about the cloud right now, but just right here on Windows, I can type get and then the word service. Oh, and by the way, PowerShell supports IntelliSense. So if you start typing a noun, you can hit the tab key and it'll try to figure out what it is you're typing. Now, if I would have just typed get the letter S, I could tab through all these commands that start with the letter S. If you accidentally pass the one you're looking for by hitting tab, you can hold down the shift key and goes backwards if you want. There's no reason why you should have to type out a big long command like that, because you can use the tab command to help you. But I'm going to type get ser, and there it is. I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to show me the services that are running on this Windows computer right now. Okay. Now, if I wanted to stop a service, like let's say I want to stop this W search service right here, I could say stop-service. And then the name of the service. Or maybe I want to start a service, like WinRM, for example, is currently stopped. I could say start-service. So I'm just changing, notice how I'm just changing the verb from get to start. I typed get service a second ago, now I'm typing start, and at that point, get-service, and then I could say -name. Now keep in mind that some of the commands you run, they give you a default output. Like if you type get-service, it's going to give you a default output. But if you if you're trying to run certain commands, they need additional parameters, and that's what these dashes are right here. So you'll do a start-service, the verb noun, space, and then a dash, and then you're identifying a parameter. Okay, when you do that. All right, that's the purpose of that. Let me get rid of that message. Okay, so now I'm going to specify the service I want to start. So I'm going to say WinRM. That's the service. Hit enter, and with PowerShell, a lot of times no news is good news. If you don't see a bunch of red text, then whatever you did was right, and it started the service. Now, if I type get-service, hit enter, you should notice that the WinRM service is officially going to be running on my machine now. See, it's running. Okay. I can clear my screen by typing CLS. I just cleared my screen. Now watch this. I'm going to stop that WinRM service. Now I started it. I'm going to stop it. Stop-service and then -name WinRM. Hit enter. And there you go. I've stopped the service. If I type get service again, and by the way, you can just hit the up arrow and it'll cycle through the commands you've typed. All right. And then it'll show that that service is now officially stopped again. Okay. And by the way, speaking of the WinRM service, that is a service that lets you remote into, allows machines to remote into your machine. If I wanted to remote into another machine and run commands, that service must be running on that destination computer. Okay, again, not talking really about the cloud here, but if I wanted to remote into another machine, I could, so I could actually type get service dash, check this out, computer name, and then whatever the name of the other computer is. If the other computer is called client 68, I could hit enter right now, and if there really was a computer called client 68 that's running WinRM, I could actually remote into that machine and run and see the services that are running on it. Another thing you can do is you can actually type enter-ps session and the name of a computer name, and then client 68, for example, and I could remote into that other machine and run commands directly from inside of it instead of just running one command at a time. Now, I'm not really getting into all that in this course because I'm sort of more focusing on teaching the fundamentals and then getting into the cloud and how we remote into the cloud, but I did want to clarify that's something you can do with your PowerShell. Okay, so that's one of the things that makes PowerShell so powerful, is the fact that you can run lots of commands locally, but you can also very easily remote into another machine. Like I can say get process, for example. That's going to show the processes that are running on this computer right here. Okay, but I could also, if I wanted to, I could say get process dash computer name client, we'll say 10, comma, client 11, comma, client 12, comma, whatever. I could see the services on all those machines. You know, another thing I can do with PowerShell is PowerShell supports something called piping. Piping is where you take the output from one command and you send it to the input of another command. So for example, I could pipe using that little bar symbol. That's the symbol above your enter key with the slash. If you hold down shift and hit that backslash, it'll create that character. Okay. And then if I wanted to, I could say out-file. And this is going to output it to a file, and I could say / client processes if I want. Okay. .text, right? And that would generate a file on the C drive called client processes. Okay. And it would actually generate it from those 3 computers if those 3 computers would allow me to remote into those. Okay. So that's the idea of being able to take the output from one command and send it over to the input of another command. I'll show another example of this here coming up in a minute. All right. But PowerShell makes it very easy for us to do that. Another thing PowerShell does is it allows us to get help on things. For example, if I wanted to see, let's say I wanted to see the Windows event log, I can type get-event log. Okay, but the problem is maybe I don't know how to use the command correctly. So if I hit enter, for example, it tells me I'm missing a value. I need to specify a log name. I'm going to hit Control-C to escape out of that. Okay, you can type get help. All right, get help on that if you want. And if you type get help, I could say get help and then type get event log. And then it'll ask me if I want to download the latest help information from Microsoft. I'm going to say no to that. And it's going to show me a little bit about using the syntax of that. Okay, using the syntax of it. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of their help documentation built into PowerShell. What I love to do is to look the commands up using the browser. So let me jump into the browser and I'll show you really quickly how you can find the knowledge base article on this command. Okay, so just popping over here at Google, if you type that command, get-event log, and you just search that, you're going to find that there is a knowledge base article on just about every single PowerShell command. So I encourage you, anytime you're working with PowerShell, check out just search for the command in like Google or something like that, pop that up, and you'll see the very first link there shows you how to use this command. So it even gives examples, which I really love. So like for example, get-event log name, showed me the newest, 5 entries or whatever. It even gets in a little bit of scripting here, how to declare variables and all that. Great. They have some great examples though that'll really help you. Okay. In fact, let's say we wanted to create a little script, and we'll do this in the ISE. We want to create a little script that is going to get the latest 5 entries of the security log on this Windows machine, and then I want to save it as a file, and I want to reformat it as a list instead of a table, and I'll show you the difference here too. So let's jump over into the ISE again. Okay, so right here in PowerShell, remember to get into ISE, you can just type ISE. It's going to open up the integrated scripting environment, and I want to show you how it kind of helps you when you're doing this sort of thing. So with the ISE, I can type get-event log, for example. And then if I space over and I hit dash, notice that it shows me all the parameters. See how much easier this is if you're trying to write a script or something? You have the parameters right here in front of you. All right, I'm going to do log name. And then here's one of my favorite things about it. If I hit space, it's going to show me the logs that are available. Okay, so not only does it detect the parameters, it detects the objects that the parameters associated with. In this case, it's the log. So I'm going to click on security, and then I'll hit space, and I'll say dash newest, and we'll say 10 entries. Okay. So from there, I can hit play, and it's going to show me the newest 10 entries. It's going to run the command down here, show it. Problem is the entries are so long, this table view that the get event log tries to show it shows it in what's called a table view. It can't show it all. It can't put it in the format to where I can see everything. So what I can do, I'm going to pipe that using that little bar symbol, and there's a command called format-list. Okay, and you can see all the format commands here too if you want. You have a bunch of options here. Format-list is the one I want. And then if I hit play, it's going to format it all as a list for me. Okay. And then if I wanted to pump this into a text file, I could say pipe again, out-file, C:, we'll just sort on my C drive, security log.txt, and it's now going to put it in a file on my C drive. So now I've got, if I go to my C drive, I can say dir star.txt, and there it is right there. So if I want to say notepad security log, it's going to open up in Notepad, and here it is in Notepad, and I can kind of peruse that at my convenience. Okay, so very helpful. So the other thing you can do here, with PowerShell, you can declare variables. Like I could create a variable called $computer name equals client 10, and then I could throw a variable in here. I could say $computer name, and I could declare, now that I've declared the variable up here, I can call upon that variable here. This is just a very basic example of using variables in PowerShell. And if I want to run this whole thing, I can hit the play button using ISE, or if I just want to run one line at a time, I could hit this run selection button here, and it'll run just that one line. Okay, so declaring variables in PowerShell really easy. You just use $. If for example, I say $num equals one, and I say we'll say num b equals 2. I could say $num plus $num b, hit enter, and it's going to add those together. Gives you a 3. Very basic example here of declaring a variable, though, and then you can utilize those variables, especially when you're doing scripts. One more thing I want to mention about dealing with PowerShell: when you save a script gets saved with a PS1 extension. The other thing is, on the computer that you're running it on, you need to make sure that the computer supports. It hasn't been restricted from using scripts. So, for example, I type get dash. There's a thing called execution policy, and by default, Windows computers have a restricted execution policy. So if I run get execution on my computer, I've already set it to unrestricted, so it'll allow me to run scripts. But if you're sitting at a new Windows computer, like a new Windows 10 computer, you'll need to type set dash execution policy, and then you can set it to execution policy. You could set it to unrestricted. You have your different options here. Unrestricted is what I've got mine to, so I can run scripts on my machine. Okay. All right. Hopefully that gives you guys just a quick look and a quick foundation of PowerShell, and give you a little bit of an understanding of working with PowerShell and how it can really benefit you. We didn't really look at it from a cloud perspective here. We just looked at it on local computers perspective. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of utilizing PowerShell commands and how they're formatted. Let's spend some time now talking about how we can use PowerShell to connect to our cloud services. Now, the first thing you got to understand is when you have a newly created operating system, you don't have the cloud-based commands. You don't have the Microsoft 365 commands. You don't have access to things like Teams and Exchange Online and all of that stuff right out of the gates. You actually have to install the commands. Now, you can run the command. You can say get dash command, and you can hit enter, and it'll show you all the commands, okay, that you have right now in memory. Of course, in my case, I have actually installed my cloud-based commands. So when I scroll down this list, I'm going to see some Azure commands and some Microsoft 365 commands and all that. There is one way you can search to see if you have, let's say I wanted to search and see if I had my Microsoft 365 commands. Those commands are called the MSOL commands. So if you actually type get command, hit the space bar, type -noun, meaning I want to search for a noun. And if you were just to type MSOL and hit enter, nothing's going to happen, because there is no command where MSOL is just the only acronym in the noun. You actually want to search using wildcards. So if I hit the up arrow, watch this. If I put a star before the MSOL, that's a wildcard, it's going to show me every command that ends with MSOL. If I was to put the star at the end, it would show me every command where MSOL starts as the noun. But I'm actually going to search and see everything that's got MSOL in it in general. So by putting the asterisk at the beginning and the end, it's going to search and look for every command that has MSOL anywhere in the noun. Now in my case, again, I've got these commands. In your case, you may not, though, if this is a new installed version of Windows. Okay, so what we got to do is we got to install those commands. We can actually install them over the internet using this command. We can type install-module and then ms online. So if you hit enter on that, it's going to ask your permission to basically install a path variable into a PowerShell. You're just going to hit yes to that. It'll also ask your permission to install something called NuGet, which is going to be the software that's going to download the commands from the Microsoft PowerShell gallery, and then it'll tell you that it'll ask your permission to install from the Microsoft PowerShell gallery, because it'll say it's untrusted gallery, even though it is Microsoft's gallery. It is a community gallery, so it'll ask your permission. You're just going to hit yes to that. Okay, now in my case, again, I've already got the commands for this. Okay, now the other thing we're going to want is we're going to need to, when we want to run these commands, we got to connect to the cloud. Right now we're not connected. So for example, if I type get-msol user, this command would display all of my users. Problem is I'm not connected to the cloud service right now. Okay, so to connect to the cloud service, you're going to type connect msol service. Hit enter. It'll pop a little box up on the screen, and this is where you're going to put your cloud credentials in. So I'm going to put in jc@examlabpractice.com, and then I'm going to put my password in here. And at that point it should connect, and as I like to say, no news is good news. If you don't get an error message, you're doing good. Okay, so we're going to type get msol user, and now I'll be able to see my user accounts. Okay, so these are the same user accounts I've got in my on-prem, or not my on-prem, but my cloud-based Azure Active Directory. Now check this out. I can also, if let's say I wanted to create a user account, something like that, I could actually create a user. I can type, all I got to do is change the verb, new-msol user. Okay, and I'm going to do user principal name. Now don't forget that if you don't know how to use these commands, remember the knowledge base articles that Microsoft's got out there are really, really good. So if I didn't know how to build a user account off the top of my head, I can just go out there and search for this command right out here on my search engine. So if I type new msol user and I hit enter, it's going to be the very first article, and I can go and I can see examples on how to use this command. Okay, it tells me all the parameters, shows me how to use it. It's very, very nice, and I definitely encourage you to check that out, to use those PowerShell articles. So if I wanted to create a user, let's say I wanted to create a user named, let's say the user is going to be, the user's email address, user principal name is an email address type name. I'm going to say, let's say David James at examlabpractice.com. Okay, close quotation mark, and then I'm going to specify his display name, which is going to be David James, and then I'm going to do first name is David, and then dash last name is James, and then let's go ahead and throw him in a department. Let's put him in the marketing department. So we'll say he is going to be marketing department. Now the other thing I can do, I can hit a dash here, and I could tab through all these different parameters. I could even, if I wanted to,
I could specify a usage location, okay, like US. I could also do, let's say I wanted to do his license. I could actually assign a license. If you go out there to their knowledge base article, you can look up the license codes for the different Microsoft products, and you can assign like an Office 365 E5 license and all that if you want. Okay, so I'm just going to hit enter, and I'm going to create this new user, and now my user David James has been created. So I actually, at that point, I should be able to go back over to like portal.azure.com or portal.microsoft.com. It really doesn't matter. You can pick one. Go to Azure Active Directory, click on users, and my user David James should be showing up in my list here. And there he is, as you can see. So that worked perfectly. Now, as far as creating a group, now I want to warn you about this. When you go to create a group, one thing that's a little strange, they will not let you create a group, a Microsoft 365 group. If I create a group, it does not give me a choice. Now, I do want to clarify, you can create a Microsoft 365 group. I'm going to show you. But you won't use this noun to do it. The MSOL noun is not going to do it. Okay? So if I say new-MSOL group, for example, and I do -display name, and I'm just going to call it, let's just call it group creation test. That's kind of a crappy name, but this is just a demonstration. So if I create that as my display name, and then you can do a description like this is a test. Okay, when you create a group, it doesn't have a parameter that'll let you change the group type from security to Microsoft 365. Okay, like you can go and you can toggle through all these parameters. It will not let you make it a Microsoft 365 group. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need to access the Exchange commands. The Exchange Online commands are going to let you create a Microsoft 365 group. And again, this is very important. If you're wanting to create a team from a group, you're going to need to make it a Microsoft 365 group. A security group's not going to do it. Okay, so here's how you're going to do that. All right. You got to connect to the Microsoft 365, Microsoft 365 Exchange Online Services in order to do it. And we are not connected to that right now. So we need to install the Exchange Online management commands. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, this is really nice. They've made this so much easier than it was like a year ago. Like even a year ago, connecting to Exchange Online was a big hassle. It's a lot easier now. So to do it, you got to install the Exchange command. So I'm going to type install -module, okay, -name, and what you're going to do is you're going to type Exchange Online Management, and then depending upon when you're doing this and all of that, there is a certain version that you need to have at least a certain version of this. So the reason I warn you about this is maybe you've installed the older version of this on your computer, and if you did, you may have out-of-date commands that don't have the commands that can do what we're about to do. So I recommend that you put -required version and then say 1.0.1, okay? And that way you're going to have at least that version, and that version is going to have all these Exchange commands in it. But you can also go out there and look to see what the latest version of the Exchange Online management commands are. You can find that in PowerShell Gallery. If you go out there and Google PowerShell Gallery, you can look up what the latest ones are, and you can install the latest one. But 1.0.1 is the minimum version you would want to get installed. So if I hit enter, it's going to install those commands. All right, now in my case, I've got most of the commands already installed, but it is going to double check, and eventually it's going to pop back up. All right, so I've already got the commands installed. The next thing you got to do is connect to the Exchange Online Services. So you're going to type connect-exchange online. Same thing, you're going to put your credentials in here. By the way, there is a way to store your credentials in a variable so that you don't have to keep putting this in. There's a little command, oops, put in the wrong password. There's a little command called the get credential command. You can create a variable and point it to get credential, and it'll store it in memory, and that way you don't have to keep putting in your credentials. Okay, so it's loading the Exchange commands here. Now,
the command that's going to let us do what we want to do is the noun for it is called the unified group. So a Microsoft 365 group in PowerShell is called unified group. If I do a search, if I say, let me just clear the screen, get command dash noun star, I'm going to say unified group star, you can see the commands that support unified groups. So there is a get command there. I can type get dash unified group, and I will be able to see my groups that are available. There's my Microsoft 365 groups right there. Now, if you want to create a Microsoft 365 group so you can associate it with the team, I'm going to type new dash unified group, okay, dash display name, and then I'm going to let's call it consumers group dash alias. This is the syntax, and by the way, don't forget you can always just look up the syntax through the knowledge base. Okay, same thing I showed you a minute ago. So dash alias, and then I'll say the alias is just going to be consumers group. All right, and then we'll say dash email address, because it is going to have an email address in the Microsoft 365 group. All right, and I'll say it will be consumers group at exam lab practice.com. You do kind of have to spell that right. That does help. All right, and then access type, this is going to be public or private. I'm going to make it a private. Oops. Let's fix that. There we go. And I think I typed it all right. So let's click to create. All right, and it does take a moment to create a unified group. It's a little bit slower than creating a security group, but as you can see, it did create it. And now I can actually type get unified group, and I can see the group. Okay, so that's how you can create yourself a group, a Microsoft 365 group. And let's, instead of going over to Azure this time, let's go to portal.microsoft.com this time, and let's see if the group is showing up over on our Microsoft 365 services. All right, so loading up a little bit slow here. All right, so we're going to go over here to groups now, drop this down, and we'll see if it appears. And there it is, as you can see, and it is a Office 365 based group. So our Microsoft 365 service, we got our Office 365 group called Consumer Group Exam. Now, it does not have a team associated with it. We know that because the little team symbol is not there. Speaking of which, I want to point out that I'm actually not connected to Teams through PowerShell yet either. I've got to connect to Teams. You got to have the Teams commands in order to do that. All right, you see the pattern here, how you're having to install these commands. Okay, there are thousands and thousands of PowerShell commands. Microsoft doesn't want to load them all up in memory, so they make us go get them and install them if we want to use them. So to get Teams, I'm going to run the following command. So I'm going to say install module. All right, and then from there, after I got a typo there. There we go. Install module, and then I'm going to say dash name, and the module we want is called Microsoft Teams. Hit enter, and of course I've already got it installed, so I'm good. But if you're doing this, it'll ask you to install it. And then just like the previous methods of working with these modules, you have to make a connection. Okay, so I'm going to type connect dash Microsoft Teams, hit enter. It's going to pop the little box up again, and then I'm going to put those credentials in, jc@examlabpractice.com. Okay, I'm going to put my password in now and log on, and I am now connected. So now I can type get command star or dash noun star team star, and you can see all the Teams commands that are available to us. For example, if I want to see what teams I've got, I can type get team. Okay, so now you've seen how you can make connections with PowerShell out to the cloud. And I'm going to be showing you a lot of commands as we move through here on creating and managing things using PowerShell. Let's talk about the concepts of creating and managing user identities. Now, if you've been in the industry for a while, you may know that Microsoft has always kind of referred to users as user accounts, but over the last few years, Microsoft has started to make a shift in their terminology. One of the things that they now say is this term identity. And so they look at it as the concept of, well, a person has an identity, and that identity is going to be tied to multiple accounts. And so you have the concept of a user account that is on-premise, such as with ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. You have cloud accounts, such as an Azure AD account, and then of course you have accounts with other, third-party providers, AWS, all of that. And things can get a little crazy when you think about that concept of, oh my God, I've got all these different accounts. You have an identity, but you have all these different accounts that you're trying to utilize. And so one of the things that Microsoft has been really trying to push, and you've probably heard this acronym before, is this concept of SSO. SSO is single sign-on. Okay, and so if you are in that kind of situation where you do have like an on-premise Active Directory, and you've also got Azure AD, you can still achieve SSO. If you were to tie your ADDS, your on-premise Active Directory, with your Azure AD cloud service, you can still achieve SSO. In fact, there is a thing called Seamless SSO, in which if we set up this thing called Azure AD Connect and tie our connections, our directory services together, again, both on-premise Active Directory and the cloud, that becomes what is known as a hybrid scenario. And in a hybrid scenario where you're connecting those two together, you can essentially make it where you can put your user credentials in. Let's say you're logging onto a computer on-premise, and it will authenticate you to your Microsoft domain as well as to Azure AD at the same time. Okay, and so essentially you have the same user account information and same password information, and it synchronizes it. You've even got this thing called the password write-back feature, where if you change your password out on the cloud, it'll synchronize back to your on-premise account. So it's a really neat system, and the idea there is to try to make that not so scary to people, of that whole concept of, oh no, I've got to have all these different accounts to use these different services. And there's even this thing known as federation, in which you can authenticate your user account against other third-party services out there, like Amazon and all of that. So they're using this concept of identity in that, I've got this one identity, and I've got all these different accounts, but I can sign in to all of them at one time, instead of me having to memorize lots and lots of user names and passwords and all that. Okay, and of course, the big fear there, the big argument always with single sign-on is, well, the advantage of single sign-on is also the disadvantage, which is, if somebody learned my one account password and user information, then they could basically get access to all my services. But the counter argument to that is that, remember, we now have the ability to use multi-factor authentication. So we can pair our password with other means of authentication, such as linking it with our cell phones, linking it with an app, and you can use biometrics, facial recognition and fingerprint matching and all that. So there's a lot of extra added security that we can enable if we want, that'll really improve and strengthen our defenses as far as somebody stealing our identity information and getting access to our accounts. Okay, now there's multiple ways to manage identities when it comes to our cloud services. You have the portal.azure.com, which is where Azure AD is going to be. And essentially, you just natively go to portal.azure.com, click the menu bar, and you can go to Azure Active Directory, and you can create, manage users, groups, and all of that there. And then there is the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, which you can get to by going to admin.microsoft.com, also known as portal.microsoft.com.
azure.microsoft.com, and you can create and manage user accounts there also. And then, of course, if you have a hybrid environment where you have an on-premise Active Directory domain services, ADDS, and you've set up Azure AD Connect, and you've got that hybrid setup, you can basically create your accounts on-premise, and they'll synchronize out to Azure AD. Now, remember, first off and foremost, Azure AD is connected with Microsoft 365 services. So you're not creating like an account in Azure AD, an account in Microsoft 365, and an account on the domain. No. First off, Azure AD is the directory services that all of the Microsoft cloud services use. Okay. But on premise, you have a different directory. You have ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. So you create an account there, and it will basically synchronize out to the cloud. It will create you in a cloud account. So you will have two accounts, but they'll work as though they were one. So it won't interact like there's only, there's multiple accounts. It'll work like there's only one account. And again, you change your password, it's gonna be synchronized and all that. Change information, it's gonna get synchronized. Now, the final way that we can manage accounts is to use PowerShell. PowerShell is Microsoft's command line environment that you can write scripts and you can automate things. And of course, you have to connect. You have to have the Azure and Microsoft 365 commands. You have to download those, and then at that point, you connect to the cloud service. And then you can basically create accounts and all of that from within PowerShell. Now, as far as licensing and roles, let's talk a little bit about that. So when you subscribe to your Azure, your Microsoft 365 services, you have licenses that you get basically like a subscription, Office 365, E3, E5, whatever it may be. And then from there you have licenses. For however many licenses you've purchased, if you purchased 25 licenses, you can license the 25 license out to your users. You can enable a license or disable a license. You can enable all of the license or just part of it. So for example, if I was to give out Office 365 E5 and I did not want somebody having access to Exchange email or something, I could disable that, or the Office downloadable apps, I could disable that. Another thing we've got is we have roles. Roles are how we give out permissions. We give out rights to our fellow admins, and in Azure, how you give out rights and permissions to your users. So a role is basically an object in the cloud that has rights to something, and then we can assign that to users and groups and then give them those privileges. Okay, so hopefully that gives you now an understanding of a little bit about the user management and a little bit of a foundation as far as licenses and roles go. Okay, now that we have an understanding of what user identities are, I want to now take a look at the actual console and create some identities, as well as go through the process of showing you the licenses and all that. Okay, so here we are on portal.azure.com. Okay, so if you want to do this with me, just open up portal.azure.com in your subscription, and you can. Okay, from there, we can click this menu bar here, this little menu button, and we're going to go to this Azure Active Directory Blade. Okay, this is called a blade. These are called blades. Makes me think of server blades, but that's what Microsoft calls them. Okay, so we're going to click the Azure Active Directory Blade. Okay, and you will see you have users right here. Okay, so we're going to click on the users blade. All right, we got our users showing up here, and I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to click to create a new user. Okay, so new user. And we can create a user. We also have the ability to invite a user as a guest. This is kind of cool because if we start working with Teams, for example, which is Microsoft's collaboration tool that's sort of replacing Skype, we can actually invite users as guests and allow them to collaborate with us in products like Teams. But not going to talk too much about that right now. I'm going to go here. I'm going to create a user. Okay. I'm going to create a user with the username Greg Johnson, okay? And we're going to say the user's name is Greg Johnson, like this. First name Greg, last name Johnson, okay? And then it's going to auto-generate a password, or you could choose the password yourself. If you want to see what the password is, there you go, okay? From there, if I wanted to assign this person to a group, I can do this. I'm going to talk about groups coming up. And then here's where I can assign roles. I'm also going to have a lesson on roles a little later, so I'll explain that more to you guys. We'll get more into that a little bit later. If I wanted to block the sign in and not let the user log on right now, maybe the employee is going to be starting next week or in 2 weeks, I could go ahead and just block them right now and not let them log in just yet. You can also block existing employees as well. Okay, now one thing that's very important I wanted to point out is I'm going to show you how to give a license, and it's important that you specify a usage location when you create a user. If you do not specify a usage location, you cannot give a license. Okay, so I want to show you how to do that. I'm going to not give the usage location so you can see the error I'm talking about. Okay, job title. We're going to say that Greg Johnson is a sales manager. Okay, he is in the sales department. We're going to click create. Okay, we've now created Greg Johnson here. We're going to click on Greg Johnson and we're going to try to give Greg a license. So we just clicked the Greg Johnson account. We're going to go here to licenses, and you can see that he has no licenses at the moment. I'm going to click to do an assignment. From there, I have 4 different types of licenses. So these are products that I have that are available to assign to my user. Okay. So I have Enterprise Mobility plus Security, Office, E5, F3, and Windows 10. I'm going to try to give him this Office E5 subscription, which is going to give him all these products here. I'm going to click Save, and I want you to see what happened. I got an error, right? I was not able to do that because he doesn't have a usage location. If you click the error, it'll even give you some of the information as to what's going on. All right. So I'm going to go back over here now. We're going to go to Greg Johnson. We're going to fix this problem, and then we're going to try to give him a subscription, okay, a license. So we'll go here to users, and we'll click Greg Johnson. We're going to go to licenses now, assignments. I'm going to go ahead and assign him to these 3 licenses right here: EMS, Office 365, Windows 10 Enterprise. Okay, so we'll hit save. All right. And oh, again, I did it again. Let's go back. Okay, so you got another shot at seeing that happen again. Let me go back here and we'll fix it. Okay, so to fix it, we're going to go under settings. Here we are on their profile. We're going to go under settings, and then at that point, we're going to specify our usage location. So we'll scroll down, and we'll go to we'll do United States here, and there it is, United States. Notice I can fill in other information for the user as well if I wanted. But I'm going to hit save, and here we go. 3 times is a charm. We're going to go ahead and assign this user his 3 licenses, which actually gives you licenses to all these things. Okay, and we're going to hit save, and notice it goes through this time. Okay, so this is one way you can create users using Azure. Okay, and then also we're going to take a look now at the Microsoft 365 side of things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to portal.microsoft.com. You could go to admin.microsoft.com. Same thing, okay? It's going to take you to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, okay, which is another way of working with users. Remember, it all ties to the same place. It all goes to Azure AD. Okay, so I'm going to drop down users here, and then I'm going to go to active users, and you're going to notice that I have the same 3 users that we just saw. So this is another place that you can create users, and I think this is a little more user-friendly for people. Okay, so I'm going to click Add a User, and I'm now going to create a new user, and we're going to call this user John Smith. Okay, and user logon name is John Smith. Okay, give a password. We could require the user to change password when they sign in if we want, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to click Next. And if I wanted to here, I can assign... No, one thing I want to point out, notice that the usage location is forced here. I have to give a usage location. So this is one thing I like about doing it through here, is I can't screw that up like I did on Azure AD, okay? The Azure portal. So I can go here and select the same 3 products I want to give here. Notice that I could, if I wanted to, I could say just don't license the user, but I do have to give a location. Okay, so now I'm going to click Next.
I could do roles and all that here, specify some more profile information if I wanted. Notice it'll let me put more in here. Okay, we're going to say that John Smith is an IT person. Okay, so we'll click next on that. Okay, we're going to now click finish adding, and we've now officially created two users and the two different graphical ways that you can do it. Okay, so as you can see, it's not too difficult, pretty easy. Definitely something that you can easily try out yourself if you want to give it a shot. But all in all, pretty straightforward to create user identities in the Azure portal as well as the Microsoft 365 portal. Now, when it comes to user management in Azure AD, obviously you can work with your individual users through the graphical tool. You can utilize PowerShell, and you could write a script that can do some bulk operations with your users in PowerShell. But what graphical options does Microsoft give us when it comes to dealing with bulk users in Azure AD right here in the portal? So let's take a look at that. We're on portal.azure.com. We're going to click on this little menu bar here. We're going to go to Azure AD. We're going to click over here on the left, and I want you to notice that there is a little drop down called bulk operations. Okay, so we have some different options here. Okay, number one, we can do bulk create. This is going to try to help us create a bunch of users at a time. We have bulk invite. So if we're going to be inviting users, maybe we're going to start supporting guest users, all that we can. Bulk delete. Okay, and then download users. Okay, so let's click on bulk create. And for bulk create, you're going to notice that it is going to let us download a CSV template. Now, you can create a CSV template on your own. That's why it says optional. But they will give you a template you can use to get an understanding of how to do bulk users. Plus, you can also click their little link, and it's going to take you over to a document that's going to kind of walk you through how to do this. So real quick, what is a CSV file? CSV file is a comma separated value file. Comma separated value just basically means you can pretty much take any type of data, and just as long as it's text, it can be saved as a text file, and that text file will separate the different pieces of data using commas, comma separated value, right? Of course, spreadsheets and all that work with this really well, so you could actually use Microsoft Excel to work with this. But what you're noticing here in their little example is name, user, all that. It's going to have different fields, and then you plug in the information in the different fields, and then at that point you can pull this back in to your Azure AD environment and have it go through and create those users. And then there's even a PowerShell command here they tell you for verifying users in the Azure portal using the get-AzureAD user command. Although you do have to install the module for Azure AD to do that, as opposed to using the MSOL module. By the way, that command is install-module space and then AZ, and you have all the Azure AD commands at that point. But or you can install the older Azure AD commands, which is actually what they're referencing in this slide is actually one of the older ones, which is the Azure AD module. You can type install-module space and then Azure AD, and you can get the older. But the newer Azure commands, oddly enough, are actually just AZ. But I'm not going down that road right now. I just wanted to throw that out there for you PowerShell enthusiasts out there. So we can download this template, we can edit the template, and go from there. So imagine a situation where maybe your company has hired a bunch of people. Maybe we've hired 50 new employees at the company. Company's like growing rapidly. They've hired 50 new employees. Maybe your HR department has a spreadsheet that has all these folks listed in that spreadsheet, their name, their address, their department they're associated with, all that good stuff. So what I could actually do is download this little template right here, and then I can open that template up in, again, like Microsoft Excel, and then at that point I can go and I can edit the information you see here. So looking at
the example on the screen, I've got these different fields, name, user. You don't even have to have all of these fields filled out, but you could rearrange that information that this HR department gave you, these new employees, put those in there, and then once you plug that in there, you could save it, and then at that point, I can upload that CSV file here, and you're going to hit submit. Now, just so you know, it's going to be submitted as a job, so it will take a few minutes for it to process through, but it will create those users in bulk for you. Okay. So again, we've also got the bulk invite, same kind of deal. You want to invite, so we just pull that little spreadsheet down there. We can open that spreadsheet up in Excel, and again, it's kind of the same concept. You don't quite have as much information with that, but you have to specify the email address of somebody. So in this case, they're inviting somebody inviting a user who has this email address for Fabricam. So maybe their company. So if I was examlabpractice.com and I want to invite somebody that has this email address, I could do that, right? So you could fill all that out if you had a bunch of users that you wanted to invite to be a guest in your environment. So then you've got bulk delete. You download the CSV for that. And at that point, you can have a bunch of users get wiped out of your Azure AD environment if you want. So maybe you've gone the opposite direction. Your company, unfortunately, is not doing as well, and the company is downsizing, and we've got to get rid of a bunch of users. Okay, so that's one way we could go about doing that. Or maybe it's a situation where the company is broken apart and you formed another company or whatever. We're going to get rid of the users in there. So we can use that little delete form here. It's a real simple one for just wiping out those users, right? Okay. So the other thing I could do is drop this down. I could also say download users. So download users is going to let me export my users into a CSV file. This could be handy in a situation where maybe you're going to move users to a different environment altogether. You're moving it between tenants, something like that. I could download this CSV file, and then at that point, I would be able to utilize that in that other environment. Okay, you'd have all those in a CSV file. So pretty straightforward in regards to going through the process of creating your CSVs, doing bulk operations. Microsoft makes it pretty easy for us to do that. It's not super duper complex. Here's an example though of exporting your users, so you'll see that it's already in that format. So great way for you to kind of move users between tenants and all that. Pretty easy way for us to manage all this. Now I want to jump back into Azure AD here, and we're going to just take a look at our licenses, our user licenses and all that. So here's what I want to do. We're going to start on portal.azure.com. We're going to click this little menu button here, go to Azure Active Directory. We're going to click on our users, and at that point we can then begin looking at what licenses our users have. Right? We can click like Andrew Wilson here, and then at that point I can click the licenses blade and notice that Andrew Wilson has not been assigned any licenses, right? So at that point I can say assignments, and I can see the different licenses that are available for Andrew Wilson to be given, right? So then I can say Enterprise Mobility plus Security, for example, and notice that as soon as I do that, I can go through and adjust certain things. So perhaps I am going to have all of this stuff selected for Enterprise Mobility plus Security, but let's also enable Office 365 E5, and maybe I do not want Andrew Wilson being able to use, let's say, Teams. So no Teams for Andrew Wilson, right? So I could take away that ability for Andrew Wilson to have access to Teams. So as you can see, you can go through here and you can turn certain things on, certain things off, perhaps that you want, to take away from an individual user. Okay. Namely, too, though, we have Exchange Online and all that. Your user to have an email address, you got to make sure he's got a Exchange Online subscription of some kind, some plan. And of course, you can look up what some of these different plans have. Microsoft has lots of documentation in terms of what each license is going to provide you with. Again, I can always go out there and just search for Office 365 E5 license, right? So if I search those keywords, they've got an article about pretty much all the licenses, and if you go there, you can sort of learn what you're going to get out of it. Of course, this was actually trying to create the license, so I actually don't want that. I want to look at this one right here, which is compare. So if we say compare, we can see all the things that we get, right? Now, if you want to break down other things like the whole Exchange Online, I could say Exchange Online P2 versus P1, for example. And then right at that point, there are articles out there about that. So compare Microsoft Exchange Online plans, and I can see, you know, what's the ins and outs of each of these things that I'm going to get with the different plans that are available, right? So Exchange Online P1, Plan 1, and P2. Okay, so this is all this P2 is actually part of my license, right? So if I jump back over here, you'll notice that that's what we're getting with this E5 subscription, right? So I don't have to buy a separate Exchange Online license for this user. It's part of my existing license, okay? And so at that point, I can click Save. Now, again, I do want to mention something that's critical here, and this is important. Notice that this failed. Now, this failed because users, to get a license, they must have a usage location. So we need to fix that. So we're going to jump back over to Andrew Wilson. We'll look at his profile. We'll go down here and right here under Settings. So we're going to click Edit. And then right here under Settings, let's give him a usage location. We'll say United States. We're going to save that. Now, let's go back over here and click Licenses, Assignments. We'll select both of those, right? And then if we want to take away the Teams ability again, all we got to do is find it. There it is. Select that, click Save. Let's see if it works this time. And it did. So now Andrew Wilson is officially licensed. And of course, you can also bulk license a bunch of users if you want. One thing I will say, though, is if I was to select multiple users here, you know, and look at what you can do, there is limitations on, you can't do like bulk on that, but you can utilize PowerShell for bulk licensing users. Okay, so that is a possibility as well. And the PowerShell command set-msol user and all that's going to let you do that. I now want to look at how we can create groups in the Microsoft 365 environment. Now, you might be familiar with groups on premise. This is not a new concept. We've had groups. We create a group object on our on-prem network. We assign users to the group, and then we can assign the group permissions to resources, right? And that's been sort of the way it's always been in the Microsoft world. Well, in the cloud, we have a variety of different kinds of groups to choose from. For one, we have a group called a Office 365 group. This is a group that's actually used for doing things like team collaboration and all that. This group will get an email address. So if I created a group called sales@examlabpractice.com and added salespeople to that, you could email that group and it would go to all those salespeople. Another thing this will do, though, is it allows with Microsoft Teams for you to have a team collaboration set up for that group where they can chat and communicate. They can do web conferencing and all that good stuff. So this is one of the main things this group is going to provide you with, and it's definitely one of the recommended groups Microsoft will tell you to use in their environment. Now, we've also got what is called a distribution group. Now, this is a good old-fashioned email-based group. This is used with Exchange Online. So what will happen is if you create that type of group, it'll get an email address. So again, if I created something like sales@examlabpractice.com, you can email the group. It's going to go to everybody in the group. Now, the difference is distribution groups can't do team collaboration, all that. It doesn't form any of the team collaboration in Teams. And also, you can't give any kind of permissions or anything like that to it. Okay. Now, if you want the best of both worlds, if you want to be able to do security and email, you could do a mail-enabled security group. The only downside with that is you don't get to do the team collaboration and all of that. Okay, it doesn't automatically form in Teams for you. The Office 365 will do that. But the mail-enabled security group, the good thing about it is the group will get an email address. Okay, sales@examlabpractice.com.
and it can have permissions to resources as well. Okay. Now, what if you want a group that can just be given rights to things? It's just used for security, just used for permissions. Well, that's what a security group is. Security groups are used when you just want to create a good old-fashioned group, add different objects to it, and give those objects permissions to a particular resource. Okay? All right. So that is the idea of the 4 different group types that you can see there. Now, one thing I do want to mention, when you get into creating groups, and I'm going to show this to you coming up in this next little segment, you can choose to make the group an assigned group, or you can choose to make it a dynamic group. Okay, an assigned group is static. This is something you're probably familiar with. You've heard of, you've dealt with assigned groups probably if you've been in IT very long. Of course, they didn't really call them assigned groups back in the day. An assigned group is just a group that you add users, you add objects to, and you can remove objects from. And then you can give it permissions or whatever you want to do. The funny thing, though, about an assigned group is it's very static. You have to manually do everything. You have to manually add objects to it and manually take them away. You run into an issue you might run into there is, imagine you got somebody in the sales department. You create a group called sales. You put your salespeople in it that are in the sales department. And then imagine you have a user who moves to the marketing department. So then they get put in the marketing group. Well, somebody has to remember to remove them out of the sales group if they're not supposed to have access to sales resources anymore. Okay, and so it's very static. You have to manually add everybody. You have to manually remove everybody. So one of the great things about our Azure AD is we can do dynamic groups. Dynamic groups are query-based. Now what this means is that I can make it where, based on an attribute with your user identity, you get put in a certain group. So for example, if you were a member of the sales department, if your department attribute for your identity says you're in the sales department, you automatically get added to the sales group. Another neat thing about that is if this person was to move to the marketing department, we change the attribute for their department from sales to marketing, then they would get taken out of the sales group automatically, and they could automatically get put into a marketing group if that was a dynamic group as well. Okay, so that's a really neat group, and I'm also going to be in this next segment showing you how all that works as well. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of foundation, and in this next little segment we're actually going to go and see about creating and managing this. Now there's multiple ways that we can create groups within Azure AD and Microsoft 365 services. Now in this example, I'm just going to look in regards to creating a group through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Now to get there, all I got to do is go to portal.microsoft.com, and that'll bring you into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Okay, so once we get in here, all we got to do is drop down where it says groups, and then click on active groups. And then from there, we can click to add a new group. All right, once we click on add a new group, you'll see the 4 different group types there. The Microsoft 365 group, which is the one they recommend. This is the one that'll create, not only will it create a group, but it gets an email address with Exchange Online, if you've got Exchange Online, and somebody can email the group, and the email will be sent to everybody that's in that group. Another thing that this group does is it's used for Teams collaboration with SharePoint and all of that. You get a shared calendar, you can share files. This group is really meant for collaboration. So for a group of people maybe that are working on a project together, they're part of the same teams and teams. This will create a team if you want it to. And it'll use, you have a SharePoint site and all of that for collaboration. You can also give permissions to this group. So this group is really, in terms of just the amount of features that the group supports, this is going to be the group that has the most features. And then, of course, you have the distribution group. Distribution groups get an email address, but they can't be assigned any rights to anything. They also don't have Teams collaboration, SharePoint collaboration, none of that stuff. And then you have mail-enabled security group. So mail-enabled security group, this group does get an email address, and it can also be granted access permissions to OneDrive, SharePoint, all of that stuff. Doesn't do the Teams collaboration feature, shared calendar, any of that. And then security groups have been given access to OneDrive, SharePoint, and also you can associate devices with a security group.
but it doesn't have the team support, collaboration, and any of that. So again, the Microsoft 365 group, that's by far the most popular. It's also the recommended one. So we're going to go with that one. We're going to click next, and then we just give the group a name. Okay, so I'm just going to call this group, we'll just call it HR. All right, maybe it's going to be for our HR department. We're going to click next. Okay, who do you want your group owners to be? So you pick out a particular user. It doesn't really matter. In my example, I'm just going to pick this guy named Aaron here. And so that'll be my group owner. Group owners can add people to the group if you want, kind of like they're sort of like the manager of the group. They can add people to the group, remove people from the group, all of that. So then we can click next, and of course we can give the group email address. In this case, I'm going to put HR, right? HR@examlabpractice.com. And then you've got privacy settings. If you want the group to be public, anyone can see the group. So, when you start getting into things like teams, people can see the team. They're not necessarily joined to it. People can see the SharePoint site, but they're not necessarily joined to it. This is publicly available. And then you can do private, which means it is completely private and nobody even knows it's there. Team, SharePoint, whatever, only people that are added to it would officially know it's there. Okay, I'm going to do private. Okay, and if you've got Teams licensing and all that, you can go ahead and add a team with it also. And then at that point, we simply just click to create, and we click close, and we've now officially got our new group. Now we do have to remember, you kind of have to be patient with Azure and Microsoft 365 services, because it does take time to refresh. But I'll go ahead and refresh my browser, and it looks like the group is showing up. And then we'll also just jump over to Azure AD through the Azure portal and just verify that the group is there also. So just real quick, we'll jump over to portal.azure.com and just click on Azure Active Directory, and we'll just verify that it's showing up there also, because it is all tied together into Azure AD. And as you can see, there is the group right there, right? Okay, so it is a Microsoft 365 group. If we go back over to portal.microsoft.com, click on groups, active group. Okay, we can click on the group HR, and if we want to manipulate some of the settings, we can add members if we want. Settings, allow external senders to email this group. Send copies of group conversations events to group members. We can also hide this in the global address list in Exchange, where people can't just look it up if it's private, right? And then Teams over here, if you got a team subscription and all that configured, your Teams license, you can also associate this with a team if you want. I actually do have a team associated with a couple of my other groups, but basically that is how you add a group just through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So here we are in portal.azure.com, and I'd like to talk about some of the group management that we have with Azure AD, right? So we're going to go here and we're going to drop this down. We're going to click on Azure Active Directory. At that point, I can click on the groups blade, and I'm going to click to create a new group here in Azure AD. And notice I've got two different group types. I've got a security group and I've got a Microsoft 365 group. Now, a security group is a group that's going to just strictly be used for permissions. So you would create the group, you could put people in the group. You can also assign devices into the group. So if you're doing device management with something like Microsoft Intune, which is their MDM, MAM product, mobile device management, mobile application management, you could actually manage devices and give devices permissions and things like that with the security group. Security groups do not get an email address. So if you create a security group, it's not going to be one of those things where it gets an email address that you can email and it's going to go to everybody in the email, right? Or in that group. Sorry. You can just simply put a bunch of users in a group, and then you can give them permission to different resources. So I could give access to things like SharePoint and OneDrive and things like that. But actually, the group everybody that Microsoft recommends is called a Microsoft 365 group. And by the way, this is sometimes referred to as an Office 365 group as well. Okay, so just be advised that sometimes it is referred to as a Office 365 group. Okay, So Microsoft 365, Office 365 group is the same thing. So then I can, the reason they recommend this is because this particular type of group is actually able to utilize, it automatically links to SharePoint, it automatically links to Teams, it gets an email address so it's accessible in Exchange Online, Planner. A Microsoft 365 group is sort of an all-in-one group. It can do almost everything that a security group can do. The one thing that a security group can do that Microsoft 365 group can't do is you cannot assign devices to a Microsoft 365 group. A Microsoft 365 group is only for users. Okay, so I can go right here and I could create a group called Sales. And it'll get an email address. Now, I haven't actually set up my linked my Exchange Online to support the examlabpractice.com, so it's got this old name in here. But we can go into Exchange Online. We can set up our accepted domain to be examlabpractice.com, and it would create an email address for that. But not getting into that right this very minute. So right there, I can give a group description. If people were to email the group, sales@examlabpractice0920.onmicrosoft.com, it would go to everybody that's in that group, by the way. Okay. Plus, it can I can have a team set up with this, a SharePoint site set up with this, all of that. Down here, Azure AD roles can be assigned. This is a newer feature, but you can go ahead and assign roles to the group. Okay, which is going to give rights out to the group. Here's membership type. Now, this is what I really want to focus on. There's two different membership types, assigned and dynamic user. An assigned group is just a static group. From there, you're just going to click on members, and then you can start assigning people to the group if you want. You can also assign an owner. The owner is, let's say Bob Jones is our owner. Our owner can assign people to the group if they want. The other thing that the owner can do is work with things like SharePoint and Teams for working with Teams channels and SharePoint sites as sort of the manager of that that service for this group. But there's something really cool here. I can also do a dynamic user, right? And by the way, if you do a security group, you can do a dynamic device. But since you can't do devices with Microsoft 365, you don't have that option. But I can do a dynamic user. Now check this out. I can go here and add a dynamic query. Okay, and from there I can click property, and we can basically make it where Azure AD will associate people with the group based on some of the attributes associated with their account. So for example, if I wanted to do like department, I could say is equal to, and then the word sales. And by the way, it's not case sensitive. So you can do uppercase, lowercase, it doesn't matter. It's not case sensitive. Although if I wanted a different value there, I could also add another expression, which could be like an or. And then I could say department is equal to, we'll say sales department. So perhaps some of our users may be labeled as sales as their value, and some of our users may be labeled as sales department because whoever did it didn't know what they were doing. Could be the case. And so at that point now, if the person's department value is equal to either of these, they will automatically become a member of that group, right? So then I can click save, and then I can go right here and click to create. And now any of my users where their departments have been flagged as sales, they're going to automatically become part of that group, right? So I could go back over here to my users, and we could put like, let's say, how about we do John Smith. So John Smith, and we will just edit John Smith, and we'll say he's part of the sales department, and we'll call him a sales rep. All right, so we'll hit save. So what will happen is John Smith will eventually show up in that group. Keep in mind that that does not always happen very quickly. You need to give Azure a few minutes. And of course, you haven't heard me say this before, with Azure, there's a lot of hurry up and wait moments. There's a lot of times where you just got to give it 15-20 minutes to take effect. Okay, so there's our group, and I don't know why my session just expired. Let me log back on here. All right, it is logging back on. Okay, so at that point I could click on members,
and I'll eventually be able to see members that are there. And I can also see my dynamic membership rules. But again, don't forget that this does not take effect immediately. This is going to take time for some of this stuff to show up. All right, you can say group memberships. You've got your dynamic rules here, but you need to give that a little bit of time to happen. All right, so that's how that's all going to work for you. And that is how you can work with your groups. Now, the only other thing I want to say is that we can also create groups, with PowerShell and all that. There's a, new MSOL group, and then you can do a unified group, which is going to be the Microsoft 365 group. So there's some PowerShell stuff there too that you can do as well.
Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.